Hey everyone, welcome to the family meeting. Monique is at a wedding tonight, so that's why she's not here. We got home at about 2 in the morning last night. Our flight was massively delayed, so we're both pretty tired. I want to say, hey, welcome to everyone joining me on Instagram. Glad you're here. Let me know if you're watching on Facebook. I know Facebook has stopped sending out alerts to people because they're trying to shadow ban us even more than they already have in the past. So if you're watching, make sure to let me know that you're watching. And hey, Laura Weimer is here. Woohoo! All right. So glad to have you here. Okay, so I've got some ideas for topics tonight. I want to start off really quick with telling you what we were up to in Virginia. We were in the Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Chesapeake area of Virginia, speaking at a Christian school there, doing a staff training for their teachers and staff. It was a great experience with them. We had a lot of fun getting to know their staff and doing the training. We did a little bit of an overview, helping the teachers understand what critical race theory is. And then we did a training on diversity, kind of a biblically faithful alternative to what normally happens in conversations about diversity. And then we did a brand new training on equity as a biblically faithful alternative to that. What does the Bible say about equity? What is it? Helping the school to begin to clarify their positions about equity. And then we did a talk helping to equip the teachers on identity so that they can help disciple the students at the school on their identity. So glad to have been there, and we're recognizing that most of the events that we do are private events. And so if you ever want to know if we're coming to your area for a public event, be sure to go to our Facebook page. Sorry, my allergies are, asthma's bad today. That's where I post public events. So if we're not posting it on social media, it's not that you missed anything. It's that it just wasn't a public event. But make sure to check out the upcoming reality tour. Monique's going to be doing a series of appearances all over the country as part of the reality tour. Make a plan, do whatever you got to do to make a road trip, get the teenagers in your life in the car and to the reality conference that is going to be near you, and hear Monique and some other really awesome speakers that are going to be on the reality tour. So go check that out, because those will be public events and you'll be able to come see her. But again, if you do live in Virginia, don't worry, you didn't miss anything. It's just we weren't doing a public event there. And most of the events that we do are not actually public. They're usually private trainings. So, hey, Miss Pauline, Monique's at a wedding tonight. So that's why y'all are stuck with the substitute teacher here. So anyways, we'd love to speak at your school, your Christian school, your ministry. If you have a Christian business and you want a biblically faithful alternative to secular DEI trainings, we're working on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we'd love to come and give your staff some training about what's happening in the culture, how to think about it from a biblical point of view, and how to actually lead the conversation on racial unity rather than just always responding and reacting to culture. So you can reach out to us about that. All right. So I wanted to talk for a few minutes here as people are jumping on about how to avoid a common mistake that I see so many people make when talking about race issues. And I think that this is happening because when we started doing this 2 years ago, and having these conversations on YouTube, uh, hardly any regular normal person had ever heard of critical theory or critical race theory. But now it's kind of in the media all the time. Everyone's wondering about like it being taught in schools and being brought into HR trainings in businesses, and critical race theory is on everybody's lips. And so now there's this big kind of backlash happening of anti critical race theory conversations. And there's some very common mistakes that Monique and I see that people make a lot in their public statements against critical race theory and on social media. So I thought it might be helpful for me to cover a little bit about that tonight in the family meeting and try to give you some tips on how to not fall into certain traps. And Amanda is asking me, what is the cost involved in visiting a school? It depends. We customize every training for every venue that we do based on the needs of the venue. And yes, we do sometimes do events on Zoom. So that's definitely an option, and it does save money. So if you want to know more about that, you can go to the Center for Biblical Unity page and click on speaking and start that application process. So when we see people standing against critical race theory, or for critical race theory, I want to help us think through that a little bit, because what I'm seeing is that people who are against critical race theory as a framework often use that as an opportunity to kind of shut down what could be an actual productive discussion about race, racism, the history of racism in America, and all of that. And so I want to encourage everyone to not make critical race theory into to demonize the topic so much that you won't even talk about it in a reasonable way with people. And if those are the kinds of posts that you're making on social media, I want to draw your attention to the fact that that's probably actually not helpful to other people who are standing by just with a question. They're just standing there. I don't know what to think. I don't know what to think. I don't know what this is. And so what you want to do is, when you're making a social media post, don't think of the extremist. Don't think of the person who's totally bought into the framework. Their ideas are really well developed. Try to think of the person who's kind of on the bubble, or they're just kind of wondering what to think. And there are a whole lot of people who actually want to have a reasonable conversation, but they're waiting for a reasonable person to show up to the conversation. And so what you want to do is think about, all right, if I'm going to say something to somebody in an email or on social media, how am I going to bring people along into the conversation so that they're intrigued, so that they want to talk to me, and so that they know that I want to stand against racism. Like, if there's a racist structure, I want to know what it is, because I want to stand against that too. And so, let people know up front, what the position is of like, hey, I am not for racism. And I don't think that critical race theory is a framework that's needed in order for us to have a conversation about racism or ethnic partiality. Rather, we can go to scripture and get that information. So I want to encourage you not to fall into the trap, or even to be participating in setting the trap, that a conversation about race, if somebody wants to talk about race, that they're automatically caught up in critical race theory, because that might not be the case. Even if they use some of the terminology, like they're posting on social media about white privilege or whiteness or whatever. It may be that they've just heard that lingo from the culture and on media, and they're not even fully aware of all of the baggage that's underneath those words. And so, don't go after them. Don't come for them just because they're using these words, especially if they're a regular person. Like they might just be a well-meaning, but a person who's not fully aware of all the baggage that's underneath the term anti-racism. So try to give people the benefit of the doubt. Try to slow the conversation down, and try not to fall into the trap or set the trap that, well, if the person wants to talk about racism or America's history of racial problems, oh, they must be advocating for critical race theory. So I think that is a very common mistake that Monique and I are noticing on social media. Another kind of related point that we wanted to bring out is that what started out as critical legal studies in the 1970s, which was sort of one of the first iterations or versions of what became critical race theory in an academic sense, it was probably actually a very important discipline of knowledge. Is the idea of critical legal studies was to look, in light of living for 15 years or so after the civil rights movement, are there still racist structures in place? Are there still racist policies in place that need to be dismantled, that in light of 15 years of the civil rights movement and living in that era, okay, is there any other work that needs to be done? That's helpful. That is a helpful question to ask. It's a probing question to ask. So we don't want to so vilify every conversation about race as being like, well, this is a conversation about critical race theory. I'm cutting you off. I'm canceling you. I'm coming after you. That's not helpful. And so when we think about these things, we don't want to just immediately make the conversation so toxic that, oh, you want to talk about race, therefore you're a Marxist. That's not helpful, okay? Most regular people, Sally in the pew at church, has no concept of how neo-Marxism is even some of the intellectual roots philosophically underpinning critical race theory. Another thing we have to understand is that what we're facing now in culture is like some popular level version of critical race theory. It's left academia. I like to say it's left the lab, and it's something else entirely, and it's morphed into something. And so we have to understand that what we're looking at is something that is an academic idea that's evolving rapidly in the popular culture. And so when you hear people say, well, critical race theory is just a legal framework, it's an analytical tool, there is some truth to that. Be gracious to people. Help them know that you're aware of that. Like, going back to the late 1970s when it started in critical legal studies, great, we can have that conversation, and we can differentiate it between what happened in the late 80s with Kimberly Crenshaw and other thinkers, and what it has evolved into the last 25 years, and what it is becoming in the popular culture. So again, we don't want to just have this knee-jerk reaction of, oh, you want to talk about race, therefore you're a Marxist. Again, that is not helpful. Okay, so we're going after the people. We want to have engaging conversation with people with sincere questions. I'm not talking about the people who are totally bought into the framework. I'm talking about being an ambassador for good, productive conversations about America's racial problems in our history, how we've made improvements, where we are now. Just because somebody wants to have a conversation about race doesn't mean that they're advocating for critical race theory, okay? So another helpful thing that I want to share with you that I've found very helpful is to differentiate between regular people and leaders. And by leaders, I mean pastors, politicians, public people, people that really are leading other people. if you're talking to somebody on social media and they're using words that you've heard associated with critical race theory, words like whiteness or words like white fragility or privilege and that sort of a thing, have grace with them. Understand that their heart is probably just wanting to have a reasonable conversation about race. And if they're a Christian, they're really probably wondering, what does the Bible have to say about that? So bring facts, bring scripture, engage them in a conversation about the uniquenesses of the Christian worldview when it comes to race, okay? So differentiate between regular people. So when you hear somebody say something, again, don't have this knee-jerk reaction against it. Investigate. Try to determine, do they even know what that word means that they're using? They may have just picked it up in culture or on the news where they've heard of it before. Let's say we think about regular people. I'm just going to assume with a regular person, when I see something in social media, I try to make the automatic assumption, this is probably misunderstanding. They probably don't know all of the baggage of the framework that comes with it. They're probably well-intentioned. They probably want to have a productive conversation about race, but they think that using these terms is going to help them. So if we stay calm and if we take some deep breaths and we don't react and instead we're thoughtful, we ask the Holy Spirit for help, we assume is they don't understand, it's probably misunderstanding. You can ask some follow-up questions. You can ask the person, can you help me understand your position? Can you help me understand, what these words mean? How are you using these words? What is your position about X, Y, and Z? Be curious. Get more data before reacting. And if that conversation is best had offline, go invite them to coffee or a Zoom call or something. But again, don't be part of the problem. Don't be part of the anti-CRT backlash to the point that it becomes unproductive. And so, confirm the person's intent. Don't assume you know their intent, okay? So assume that they don't understand all of the neo-Marxist cultural postmodern baggage. Assume that they may have heard some words in culture or on the news or even from their pastor, but they don't know everything that's entailed in that. So investigate, ask questions, confirm their intent, don't assume. And then inquire, and have the conversation. Be brave and have that conversation. Now, that's for lay people. That's for regular people, okay? Now, let's talk about leaders. To me, leaders is in a little bit different category, especially if they're pastors, elders, and that kind of thing, because they're speaking with more authority over issues. So that's where I'm going to go to that person and I'm going to assume they might be unaware, but I want to have the harder conversation with them and have more accountability about what they're believing. So I'm going to press them a little harder. I'm going to ask them for specific examples. I'm going to ask them for data and outcomes, and I'm going to ask them for support and names and books and where they got this information, because now we're talking about shepherds. We're talking about thought leaders. Okay, so there has to be more accountability. And, again, I'm not going to immediately jump to this reactive place. I'm going to gather data, but I'm also going to assume that they have more awareness of the issue. They've probably investigated it more because they're in leadership. I would hope so. I would hope that they would. Okay, so I'm going to assume, all right, they've probably studied this, so I want to know what books are they interacting with, what articles have they read, who are the leading the thinkers that they're bringing forward, who have they been influenced by, and asking them for biblical support. So that's going to assume you've done enough homework that you can interact with them with that biblical support. You can provide counterexamples. You can provide guidance in the conversation and a level of accountability. And then you're going to want to check back with them. Like, hey, maybe I could recommend they read Thaddeus Williams' book on justice. Maybe the voices that they've been interacting with on justice are completely as biblically faithful as what we might see in Thaddeus's book or Scott Allen's book. So, hey, can we read it together? Can we get together and talk about it after you read it? But having a level of accountability, bringing it to the broader leadership of the church, because again, we're talking about leaders. But if you get to the end of that road and then you realize like, oh, this leader or this church leadership team, they're aware and choosing. They're choosing the path that they're going down. They know what this is. That is a totally different scenario, because then that means they've researched it, they've looked into it, or they don't care to research it any further. Their hearts are convicted. Then you're in a situation of how will you react? How will you respond? What steps will you take? So those are some tips in differentiating between leaders and regular people. Hey, Terrence. Yeah, Monique was hoping she could meet with you guys too, or meet with you this week in Virginia, but just didn't work out. Whenever we travel, we always have a very packed schedule. So doing meetups is really challenging a lot of the time. Okay. So another tip that I see a lot of people post on social media is they'll say, well, have you read such and such book? Is it CRT? And obviously Monique and I can't comment on every single book in the world that incorporates or CRT or talks about race or whatever. We have a few of our recommended books on our website, but there's a whole lot of books that we don't comment on. You can always go check out Neil Shenvi's reviews. Those are helpful. But I thought that Monique and I have talked about this quite a bit, and I wanted to offer some additional tips so that, again, you don't fall into this reactive posture of reacting against CRT. Like, don't be part of the anti-CRT mob. Like, yes, we need to stand against it. Yes, we need to be informed about it and speak out about it when it's really present. But we also have to sometimes slow our roll, do some digging, understand what people's actual positions are. So if you're wondering, like, what do I do with a book? My church, my small group, my employer, the ministry I work for, my kids' class, they want us to interact with book X. I don't know what to think about it. So I think that the first thing, again, is you can always do some research. You can look up the book. You can look on Amazon. You can see what other books the person has written. You can see who the endorsements are. Endorsements tell you who the clique is that this person hangs around. Endorsements can be very interesting and helpful to know what a person's point of view is. Look at the publisher. Now, publisher is a little less meaningful than it was 10 years ago. It used to be, I could tell you, oh, if a book's published by Moody or Baker, it's solid. Those days are kind of gone. And so looking at the publisher is a little less reliable, but it might at least tell you if it's sort of trying to be Christian or completely secular. Look at what other books this person has written. That can be helpful. But again, we don't want to fall into this reactive posture that, oh, the book is talking about America's racial history and some of these difficult aspects of our history. That is not a CRT conversation. It might be, but it doesn't have to be. It's not automatically that way. And so if a book is talking about America's struggle to live out its best principles, its founding documents when it comes to race, don't automatically fall into the reactive posture of, oh, that's CRT. It might not be. It might just be a history book, okay? Another kind of tip on evaluating a resource is, when we help our young people to understand a fuller picture of America's history, we can help them do that within a framework of understanding sin. That's a deeply Christian idea, that we are not always good to each other. We do not always treat each other well. And here are some examples in history where that has been true. That can be a helpful conversation. We don't have to paint America as like this completely noble nation all the time. Now, I think what we can do is look at the nobility of our founding documents and the principles that are founded there, because those principles are based on the vision of equality of the Judeo-Christian worldview, and we have done better and better at living up to those principles as a nation. And those principles were noble and of a truthful nature. And so as we've struggled with humanity's sin and how we compare that to the noble vision of our founding documents, we have struggled as a nation. We fought an entire war, to try to live up to our founding principles. But we can look at that in a holistic way, and we can help our kids think about how sin shows up in history. Doesn't mean that you're advocating for the 1619 Project because you want to talk about slavery. That's not helpful, okay? Just because somebody wants to present a fuller picture of America's struggle with sin doesn't mean they're advocating for the 1619 Project, okay? That is a reactive position that will not help our cause if we villainize things that way. Okay, so if you're looking at a book, don't be afraid to read books. If you genuinely want to know, or if your kid's going to have to read a book for school, you read the book. You find out about it. You read ahead. You be in the conversation. Even if your child is going to a school, you as the parent are ultimately responsible for what your child is being taught. So that's God's command to us as parents. So it's okay to get help. It doesn't mean we have to teach our kids everything, but we are ultimately responsible before God. So if your kid's reading some book in school that you don't agree with, okay, you can decide as a parent, what you're going to do about it and, how you're going to handle it. But if you want to do that, great. You read ahead. You read the book. You be in a conversation. You be proactive. And that will help the child too. And then you can discuss things that come up from a worldview standpoint and where Christianity aligns and doesn't align. But again, that assumes that you have equipped yourself. You have done some homework and you are accepting your God-given responsibility before God to educate your children. I think that another big problem in the anti-CRT conversation right now is there's a whole lot of people who are speaking out against critical race theory who don't actually know what critical race theory is. You watch some videos by Chris Rufo and you think you got it nailed. That is not helpful. Interacting with first sources, if you are going to speak out against critical race theory, is vital. So if you're in a leadership position in your homeschool co-op or in your church or at your ministry or business, you are going to need to take the time to interact with first sources and make sure you really understand it. If you need the Cliff Notes, go read Pat Sawyer's articles, his series in Christianity Today. There is a 10 or 11 point definition of critical race theory. Make sure that you understand what CRT actually is before you speak out about it. Don't get into a conversation. Don't be part of the mob in being part of the anti-CRT mob, speaking out against it if you don't actually really understand it yourself. That is not helpful. It does not help our cause as we are standing up against it. Also, if you're in a situation where a book is being required, recommended for you by a Christian ministry, at your church, in your business, whatever. Ask your leadership for clarity about their position, either on critical race theory or just simply bypass that terminology altogether since it's become so loaded, and just say, can you explain to me your position on diversity, equity, and inclusion? What's the policy? You can ask for it in writing. Can you clarify these things? Okay? So that if they're recommending a book and it already fits with policies they've already adopted, then you know what to expect. If they don't have a statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can raise the legitimate question, well, why are we reading this book? Okay? So don't simply be anti-CRT. This is not helpful. Yes, we can stand strong against it, but we have to be strategic in how we do it. When we just go off half-cocked and we're reacting all the time and we're posting memes on social media against it, that actually doesn't help people. I want you to think in your mind, think about the people who follow me who are on the bubble. They're just CRT hesitant, or they're anti-CRT hesitant. And they need somebody to come along and give them reasonable answers. Is what you're posting helping those people? That's who you want to entice and bring over, okay? So those are some things to think about, some pitfalls that we're seeing on social media that we really want to help you avoid. So I hope that is helpful. I want to encourage you, if you're interested in these topics, to go check out my current teaching series on justice. I've done 2 episodes on that so far. The 3rd one is coming this next Wednesday, so in about a week. So again, I see so many people on social media commenting against secular social justice, but they're not doing a good job of putting forward a biblical vision of justice, okay? Justice matters. Justice is not synonymous with liberalism. Justice is not an anti-Christian liberal idea. Rather, we have to have clarity about a biblical definition and vision for justice and how we can proactively stand for God's vision of justice, okay? So, again, don't be part of the mob, all right? Please don't weaponize our materials. Please don't use our materials to say, aha, please don't do that. Please ask the Lord to give you a heart for how you're going to communicate with people in your sphere of influence, those people on the bubble, those hesitant people who are just waiting for a calm person to come along and address their questions. Okay? So check out my justice series. Again, it's 2 parts so far. 3rd part is coming next week. Also, I want to let you know it's kind of the last chance to sign up for my God's Big Picture class. I don't know if anyone can put some links for me in the comments. That would be great, to some of these resources. I don't know if Laura's still watching or not. I saw her on there earlier. But it'd be super helpful if somebody can jump on there and put some of the links to some of these resources in the comments. Also, the UP conference. We dropped a new video today, a new promo video for the UP conference. If you're interested in biblical justice and understanding how to live that out, go check out the UP conference. Share it with your pastor. Share it with your friends. Create a watch party for your small group. And create an environment just in your sphere of influence of what you can do to share the good word of justice. Okay. Now, let me see how I'm doing on time. All right, we're doing pretty good. Yeah, I appreciate your comments. I'm watching them here as I'm talking. And it sounds like a lot of you fight the desire to sometimes want to become the anti-CRT mob. And it's good to notice. It's good to notice to say, oh yeah, how can I do better? And use that delete key before you post, to really be in a conversation with the Lord about how you can have more productive conversations about these issues and not just automatically think every conversation about race is also a conversation about critical race theory. Um, let's see. Raina, hey Raina says I've learned so much great and awful history this last year, as well as so much about critical race theory, and our school is using culturally responsive teaching, which also seems to be problematic at times. Not certain if it is all the time. I honestly think some of the teachers are critical race theory advocates, so teaching culturally responsive teaching is then scary. Yeah. So that is actually a very helpful comment, Raina. Culturally responsive teaching, culturally responsive curriculum, cultural competence, these are all synonyms for equity in education. And equity in education rests on the idea of Kendi's vision of anti-racism. Now, it is a debated point as to whether or not Ibram X. Kendi is technically a critical race theory advocate, or he is or he isn't. Some people say he is, some people say he isn't. I'll leave that to the academics to debate. But educational equity is kind of built on the principles of Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and then how would those play out in a classroom? So when you hear alternative terms like cultural competency and culturally responsive teaching and these kind of things, opportunity gaps is another common word. These are all part of an interconnected group of terms in racial educational equity. So when you hear that term, Raina, it could mean that the principles of critical race theory are resting underneath it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every teacher who uses those ideas in their classroom is actively advocating for critical race theory. Many of them could be unaware of, again, all of the philosophical baggage that rests underneath those terms. They could just be thinking, oh, I'm teaching a fuller picture of history, or I'm teaching history in a way that includes the histories of people who have traditionally been left out of the curriculum. So again, we don't want to assume, and we have to kind of have a lot of discernment to wade our way into it. Now that said, we've gotten enough letters from teachers in public school education who have had to deal with overt critical race theory principles in coming into trainings, and they are expected to declare allyship for groups that would go against the Christian worldview. So that is another whole problem there. Thank you, Laura, for posting that. Laura, if you could also post a link to my class, God's Big Picture, if people want to know about that, and also to my current teaching series on justice. Thank you. You're way ahead of me, as usual. Awesome. Okay, so we're just going to be on here for a few more minutes, listening to me ramble. And Carlin, glad to see you. I've been wondering how you're doing. Glad to see you on the stream tonight. He says very good points about not simply being anti-CRT. Lori says very good points about not being part of the anti-CRT mob. That's not helpful. Yeah. Hannah says, yes, I've had to fight the urge to skip the hard conversations this year in our homeschool curriculum. CRT wasn't even mentioned, but I've been so on edge about it, I almost skipped a worthy lesson. And good for you for noticing and to be in the risk. And you know, sometimes being in the risk is okay, and even when it doesn't turn out very well, you know, there might still be even then be something to be learned from it. So there's that. So I've seen a lot of posts recently on social media, and I had a very good friend text me last week asking a question. She says, I'm so frustrated by the use of fear in order to take away our freedoms in our country. And I thought that's such an interesting statement. I wanted to talk a little bit about fear and the use of fear and some thoughts that I have about what's happening in the culture right now. So I'm going to do that in just a minute. There's a comment here on Instagram I'm going to go to. How do we know when to engage with culture and institutions and when to walk away from our own institutions? How do we be in the world but not of it? Specifically regarding CRT and social justice conversations. Well, I think you have to start first of all with educating yourself. I mean, the only way to develop discernment, besides just having it as a supernatural spiritual gift, is if you're going to develop discernment, you got to do some homework. You got to do some reading. You got to do some learning. You got to know how to interpret the Bible properly. You're going to have to get grounding in some good theology, and so that then when you encounter the counterfeit, you'll know the difference. And I just see too much reliance on discernment bloggers, discernment YouTube channels. Troubles my heart so much that people use discernment bloggers and discernment ministries as a substitute for doing their own learning and their own homework. You've got to take time to learn and to learn your own worldview before you're learning about other worldviews. And so that is kind of the first thing. So that you know when to walk away or when to rescue, try to be a stand for rescue. I think the other thing you've got to do is talk to the leadership. Just like I said earlier, you can assume that this is a misunderstanding or assume that they don't know any better. But after you've had the conversations and you realize, oh, they're aware and choosing. This is what they're choosing to go down this path. Then that's a time for you might have to separate yourself from them because they're aware and choosing. Now it's different if they're unaware but open to learning. That's a very different posture. So in all of the 100, 200 hours that I've spent investigating Christian colleges and having conversations with deans, department chairs, presidents, and all of that, there is a vast difference between talking to somebody in leadership who has made up their mind and they think they understand the race and justice discussion and they're enacting policies based on that understanding versus those who are saying, I'm not really sure, but I'm open to learning. Those are two entirely different postures. So if you go to your pastor and he has a posture of, look, I've read this, I've interacted with these sources, and this is how I am preaching from the pulpit, and it's clear he's not open to any other perspective, then that's probably a discussion of, I might need to start looking for another church. Whereas if you go to your pastor and your elder team and they're like, we're still trying to find our way through this. If you know a good book, if you know a good source, please tell us. We want to still learn. There's hope. There's hope for that. So that's my best thought about that question. I hope that helps you out, Laura. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. I might have to end early. My asthma is bad tonight. So let's talk a little bit about fear and what's happening in our culture right now, because fear is everywhere. In fact, I'm starting to see this new term of fear porn on Twitter, where they're just, the fear is so rampant. Oh my goodness. And if I don't recommend going on Twitter, but if you're on Twitter, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, the levels of what is being posted on Twitter is mind-boggling, and it seems absolutely designed to incite fear in people. And I have some thoughts about that. I have a couple of thoughts, and I'm just going to offer these thoughts more from a spiritual perspective. I'm not interested in the politics, so please don't post any political statements on the stream. I'll appreciate that, and if you do that, I'll delete them later. But I'm just speaking of this purely from the standpoint of a spiritual issue. Hey, Justin, glad to see you. When we think about the issue of fear, I think that fear is fundamentally a tool of the enemy. Now, fear can be good sometimes in that a healthy fear of God, to know who I am as a sinner and who God is as my creator and judge, that's a healthy fear. To know what my future will be without him, right? So if I am far from God's covenant and I am far from him as my father, to know that God's judgments are going to come against me, I ought to be afraid. That is a healthy fear, okay? But that's not the kind of fear I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fear in culture, and I really think it's a tool of the enemy, and it's, if I strip it all the way down, it's a fear of death. I think that many people are afraid of dying. And so they're very willing to give over what our country has historically called personal freedoms for the sake of trying to save themselves from death. I think that the enemy is really doing a great job of creating a narrative and getting people really riled up about fear. And I think the fear is the enemy knows that we fall into fear easily when it's things we don't understand. And what little do we understand about disease? This disease that we're dealing with right now, or with a political system, we're watching the unrest in Afghanistan falling apart in the Middle East. These are things that we don't understand. We don't have any control over them. It's scary. And so the enemy just uses that to stir up the fear, right? And so I think that the fear is being used by the enemy. And so then what happens is the enemy starts whispering these fears to you. And then when you start coming into agreement with the fears, then it's almost like it's like a gear lock. It's like locked in your mind. And it's really hard to unsee it, right? And I think that fear is it's a scheme of the enemy to diminish our quality of life and cloud our thinking and our judgment, and things become very confusing, and the enemy just builds on that. He builds on that. And so I think that for the non-Christian, now an increasing number of people in our country identify as nuns and duns, all right? So the nuns are people who have no religious affiliation. They're sort of some version of secular humanists, where they think that, there may not be ultimate meaning and purpose in life, but they can create their own meaning and purpose by making the world a better place and being a good person. That's a secular humanist. Duns are people who have deconstructed away from the faith. They maybe grew up as a Christian, but they've deconstructed. And as these numbers of nuns and duns continues to grow, the alternative perspective is some version of secular humanism. I actually think critical theory and critical race theory is a version of secular humanism, if I strip it all the way down to the worldview level. So if I'm not a Christian, and the enemy is really working hard to get this fear scheme going, and if I'm not a Christian, God doesn't exist, so the greatest threat to me is death. I don't want to die. And so for that person, the worst thing that could happen to them is death. And the fear is the tool that the enemy uses to multiply that. And so when they think about all of these lockdowns and restrictions and all of this kind of thing, to me, it makes perfect sense why so many people are willing to go along with this. Because if you don't believe in the sovereignty of God, if you don't believe that God's in control of this, and you think you're all you got, yeah, I'm going to hand over some power to the government. Because what is the highest power in your life if you're a secular humanist? It's the government. The government is your God. He is your sustainer. The government is your provider. The government is the one who can help you prevent death. Okay? So if you're a secular humanist, you don't believe God exists, those numbers are on the rise, handing over more and more power over your life and your individual decisions to the government makes a lot of sense, because the government is acting, functionally speaking, as your God. Okay? So now for the Christian, we know that God he's sovereign, right? He is going to bring history to the conclusion that he wants. The gospel is going to go out, and people will be saved, and the gospel will be multiplied. The kingdom of God will be multiplied. So we don't fear human governments. The Christian, the informed Christian, knows that there is a higher authority than a human government, and that's God. See, the Christian knows that there's multiple spheres of governing authority. I govern myself. There's a lot of scriptures about how I govern myself. I don't lie. I don't steal. I don't murder, right? I don't commit adultery. These are things about how I govern myself. Then there's government in a family. There's a mom and a dad and children. That's a government. It's a sphere of authority. Then there's government in the church. There's elders and pastor and people, and God has appointed that group to have different authority, okay? Than the parents. The parents are over education, over their children, and that sort of thing. The church is over different spheres of authority. The government is over different spheres of authority. The government's in charge, according to God, of public restraint of evil and protecting the innocent. That's the government's job. The government is not according to God's word, the government's not actually in charge of education. That's the parents' job. We've got that a little mixed up, but God delegates his authority to these different spheres. And so the Christian thinks about the world way differently than the secular humanist. The secular humanist thinks of government as acting as their God. It is the highest authority. The Christian knows the government is not the highest authority. God is the highest authority. Okay? So we as Christians, we have to know the truth, that we don't act out of fear. We don't act out of fear for governments, because we know that governments are not sovereign. God is sovereign. So we have to stop and check in. Like, am I living like a pagan? Am I thinking like a pagan? Am I thinking that the government is actually the highest authority? Am I functionally living as if the government is the highest authority? Ooh, that's a tough question. Am I thinking biblically about how God has delegated different authority to different spheres of sovereignty, and that I know what the government's job is, I know what the family's job is, I know what the church's job is, I know what my job is, and I know I'm thinking biblically, I'm thinking Christianly, when I am not so gripped by fear that I think the government would be better off to just take over, I hand over my self-governance to the government. Okay, because the government can manage me better. That's not God's vision for the human life. Okay, so this is how we want to think. So if we know that our highest authority is God, he is the king of our life, this is why it's important to understand how God has delegated authority. So you can find out more about that in my teaching series from last January. It's called One Nation Under God. And I go into all kind of detail about these issues. But as we think about how people are reacting to this cultural moment, I get it. It's fearful. I have never seen this much instability in the world in my lifetime. I lived through the 70s. There was a lot of instability. I was only a child, but this just feels so different. And watching Kabul fall and watching everything that's happening, yes, this is a very destabilizing time. So Christians got to be really like crystal clear about our understanding, our belief about fear, that not living like a pagan. We don't live like the pagans. We don't make the government in charge of our life. The government, according to scripture, is in charge of restraining evil through God's laws and protecting the innocent. That's basically what God has said the government is in charge of. Okay, so we have to think about that. And I think that these are difficult questions, they're difficult times, but we don't want to fall into fear. God is still reigning, and he's the king of your life. This is where it starts to not be very hypothetical. It becomes really real. Those Christians in Afghanistan, they will gather to worship the one true God, and there's a high likelihood they will be slaughtered. Christians in America can't really decide whether or not it's important for us to meet. We have to think about this. We do not live like the pagans. So we've got to do a little inventory on ourselves of where we are. Okay, so hopefully that gives you some things to think about with regard to fear. I want to just encourage you again to go check out my teaching series on justice. Sign up for my class, God's Big Picture, and check out the UP conference. Monique and I would love to see you there to really help you in your stand for justice. Okay, let's read through some of the comments here before we sign off. Carlton. Oh, thank you, Carlton. Dropping so much good knowledge on fear, connecting it to the real world events and how the evil one uses it. Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Such an important conversation. Fear of death, Elaine says, shows up in tons of health movements too. Not to condemn health choices, but a total buy-in on maximizing this earthly body as if it is all you have. Yeah, I think that is definitely can be a component of some aspect of health movements is, hey, I'm all for taking care of our bodies. That's a good thing. God's created us. We're body, soul, and spirit. I'm not a Gnostic. I think the body is good. But when death becomes like your controlling idea, your controlling motivation, that's where you might need to sit back and do a little inventory on where you're at and what you're thinking, and if you're thinking like a pagan more than a Christian. So, all right. My primary emotion in regards to Afghanistan is deep grief. Mine too, Lori. We're hoping to do our show on Saturday. We're putting it together right now with a former missionary who lived for several years in Afghanistan, preaching the gospel, and many of her friends who are still there, and her communications with them and firsthand information on what's going on there. So stay tuned for our show on Saturday. Okay, on Instagram, one more question. How do you think we can restore a rightly ordered worldview, the different spheres you're mentioning, in an ever-increasing confused and disordered society? Well, again, we're going to have to study the Bible first. I would commend to you my teaching series, One Nation Under God, where I go into that in significant detail of the different spheres of authority that God has appointed for us. And I think that the ultimate way to restore right order is at the worldview level. We've got to preach the gospel. We have to, through the power of the Holy Spirit, get transformed hearts and lives. That's really at the most foundation of restoring order. The reason we're in the situation we're in right now is because we have so many unregenerate people in our land. So the Judeo-Christian worldview worked well as a framework for establishing our country and running it for a couple hundred years. But the more that hearts and minds have drifted away from personal faith, Now less and less people are seeing the need for the laws that have brought order to our country. So we're in a very shifting time. That is for sure. Okay, I hope that is helpful to everyone. I want to thank you for watching tonight, and Monique will, Lord willing, be back next week. I think that's her plan. We've got a lot of traveling and speaking this fall, so we'll keep you up to speed on where we're going to be. Go check out the reality tour, public appearances that Monique is going to be doing this fall and in the spring, and make a plan to be there, to see us there, and bring your teenagers to the reality tour. So thanks everyone. I hope you have a good evening. Good night.